The wind howled across the desert plains like a wounded beast, carrying with it the sting of dust and sorrow. Clara Bennett tightened the shutters on her small cabin, her hands trembling from more than just the cold. The storm had rolled in without warning, black clouds swallowing the horizon, lightning flashing over the distant mesas. She whispered a prayer beneath her breath, the same one she'd said every storm since her husband died 3 years ago. Lord, just let me see the morning. The cabin creaked and groaned as the wind slammed against it. Her lantern flickered, throwing long, dancing shadows across the wooden floor. She was reaching to secure the door latch when she heard it, hooves pounding against the earth, growing weaker, uneven. Then a crash, her heart seized. Nobody rode this far out anymore. Not at night. Not in a storm. Clara snatched her rifle from above the mantel, her breath catching in her throat as she cracked the door open. The wind tore at her hair and dress, nearly knocking her backward. Through the curtain of rain and dust, she saw a horse collapse in the mud, and beside it, a man slumped motionless, half buried in the storm's fury. Sweet mercy, she whispered, stepping out into the chaos. The man was heavy, his skin burned by sun and battle, his chest bare except for torn leather and blood. Even before she saw the long black braid and the turquoise necklace, she knew he was Apache. Every story she'd ever heard about them roared through her head. Raiders, killers, men who took vengeance with fire. Fear pulsed through her like lightning, but she couldn't leave him there. Not to die like a wounded animal in the rain. Grunting with effort, Clara dragged him toward the cabin. The mud sucked at her boots, her muscles screamed, but she didn't stop. Once inside, she kicked the door shut and fell to her knees beside him. His breathing was shallow, his body shivering from shock. Blood soaked through the band of cloth tied around his ribs. She hesitated only a heartbeat before fetching her sewing kit, a bucket of water, and her husband's old whiskey bottle. "If you wake up, don't you dare kill me," she muttered, trying to convince herself she was still sane. As she cleaned the wound, he stirred, a low sound rising from his throat, half pain, half warning. His eyes opened, dark as storm clouds, and fixed on her. She froze. He didn't speak, but his gaze was sharp. "Alive? You're safe," she said softly. "You hear me? You're safe." He tried to rise, but she pressed him back with a firm hand. "Don't move. You'll bleed to death." For a long moment he just stared at her, his breath ragged. Then slowly he relaxed. Clara could feel his pulse under her fingers, strong, defiant. She worked quickly, stitching the torn flesh, pouring whiskey to clean the wound. He didn't make a sound, only clenched his jaw until sweat beaded his temples. When it was done, she covered him with her husband's old quilt. The wind outside screamed, rattling the roof. But inside the cabin there was only the sound of two hearts, one afraid, one refusing to die. As the night deepened, she lit another lantern and sat in the chair by the hearth watching him. His chest rose and fell in slow, steady rhythm. She could see the lines of exhaustion on his face, the faint trace of blood drying on his shoulder. "Who are you?" she whispered, knowing he wouldn't answer. He didn't move, but she thought, perhaps imagined, that his lips formed a single word. Taza Clara leaned back in her chair, the weight of what she'd done settling over her. If anyone found out she'd sheltered an Apache, she'd be run out of town, or worse. Yet as she listened to the storm fade and felt the warmth of the fire creeping across her skin, she knew she wouldn't undo it. He was alive because of her. And for the first time in years, her cabin didn't feel empty. The desert storm finally died by dawn, leaving behind a hush so complete that Clara could hear the dripping of rain from the eaves and the soft crackle of the fire. The man, Taza, if that was truly his name, lay still beneath the quilt. For a moment she thought he might have slipped away during the night, but when she knelt beside him, she saw the slow rise and fall of his chest. He lived. She exhaled shakily, unaware until then that she'd been holding her breath. Her hands brushed his forehead. It was warm, fevered. The wound at his side had begun to darken around the edges. She fetched a rag, dipped it in cool water, and wiped the sweat from his skin. He flinched at her touch but didn't wake. Outside, the desert stretched silent and washed clean by the rain, but Clara knew peace was only an illusion. Somewhere out there, men would be riding soon, settlers with rifles, soldiers on patrol, searching for any sign of Apache movement. If they found him here, she'd lose everything. By midday, Taza stirred. His hand twitched, then rose weakly, catching hers before she could pull away. His grip was firm even in his weakness. His dark eyes opened, meeting hers. There was confusion there, suspicion, and then a faint understanding. "You're safe," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if he could understand her words. "You're hurt, but I fixed you up as best I could." He blinked slowly, gaze drifting around the small cabin, the shelves lined with jars, the rough-hewn table, the rifle leaning by the door. His chest rose sharply when he saw the weapon. Clara followed his eyes and quickly said, "It's not for you. It's for wolves." Something flickered in his expression. A shadow of disbelief, then a glint of humor, faint and brief. She almost smiled. For the next few hours, they spoke through gestures. She pointed to the pot over the fire, then mimed eating. He nodded once, sitting up slowly with a grimace of pain. Clara fetched a bowl of broth, thick with potatoes and onion, and placed it in his hands. His fingers brushed hers, rough, strong, burning with heat. He ate slowly, his movements deliberate. When he finished, he nodded once, placing the bowl down with care. "Thank," he said, his accent heavy, the words strained but clear. Clara blinked. You speak English?" He gave a faint shrug, eyes never leaving hers. "Some." "Well," she said softly, "that's more than I expected." For a long while, they sat in silence, the firelight flickering across his face. He had strong features, high cheekbones, a straight nose, lips pressed in determination even at rest. His hair, thick and black, hung loose now that she'd removed the braid to clean his head wound. There was a quiet dignity in him that unsettled her more than any threat could. That evening, when the sun bled red across the desert horizon, she caught him standing by the window, steadying himself against the wall. "You shouldn't be up," she said sharply. He turned his head slightly, his eyes catching the light. "I go," he murmured. "No," she said, stepping toward him. "You're not strong enough." His gaze held hers. "Men come. See me here. You die." Clara felt her throat tighten. He was right. If anyone discovered him, they'd call her a traitor. But she squared her shoulders. "Then we'll make sure they don't find out. Sit down before you fall over." For a moment he hesitated, testing her resolve. Then, slowly, he obeyed. When night came again, he slept near the fire while Clara sat at the table, sewing the tear in her husband's old blanket. She told herself she was doing what any good woman would, showing mercy to a dying man. Yet she knew there was something deeper stirring in her chest. Every time he looked at her, she felt something shift, something alive and dangerous, like the storm that had carried him to her door. And as the flames danced low, casting their faces in golden shadow, Clara realized that silence had become its own kind of language between them, one she was beginning to understand. 3 days passed since the storm. The sky had cleared to a brilliant blue and the desert stretched wide and still, the earth breathing again after the rain. Clara stepped outside with her pail to fetch water from the creek, careful not to leave footprints too close to the cabin. The air smelled of wet sage and dust, beautiful but heavy with tension. Inside, Taza was healing fast. His strength returned more each day, though he still moved with caution. He said little, his words measured and soft. Sometimes he spoke in his own tongue while staring into the fire, and Clara would pause her chores, listening to the rhythm of his voice. It sounded like wind through canyon walls, foreign, low, and full of something she couldn't name. That morning, as she bent over the creek, a flicker of movement caught her eye, a glint of metal on a far ridge. She straightened, heart pounding. For a moment, nothing stirred. Then she saw them, 3 riders silhouetted against the pale sky, rifles slung over their shoulders. The settlers. Her pulse quickened. They weren't supposed to come this far south, not near her land. Clara set down the pail, her fingers trembling. If they found Taza, if they even suspected, he wouldn't live to see another sunrise. She hurried back to the cabin, forcing calm into her voice. "Taza," she called softly as she stepped inside. He looked up from where he was sharpening a knife near the fire. One glance at her face and he knew. His hand tightened on the blade. "Men," she nodded. 3 on the ridge." Without another word, he moved, swift and silent. He pulled on his shirt, wrapped his wound with the leather strap, and reached for his knife and bow. But Clara blocked the door. "You can't fight them," she said. "You're not strong enough yet." He frowned. "If they see me, you die too." "Then we'll make sure they don't," she said firmly. "Go below." He didn't understand at first, so she dropped to her knees and lifted the trapdoor hidden beneath the rug. Her late husband's old storm cellar. "In here," she said. Taza hesitated, his gaze lingering on her face. Then with a slow nod, he descended into the shadows below. Clara lowered the door and spread the rug back over it, her hands shaking as she did. Moments later, hoofbeats thundered outside. Clara took a steadying breath, grabbed her rifle and stepped to the doorway. The three men reined their horses near her fence. She recognized one, Eli Parsons, a rancher from town, a man who'd never hidden his dislike for her living alone. "Mornin', Mrs. Bennett," Eli called, his voice rough. "You seen anything strange around here lately? Apache signs? Smoke tracks, anything?" Clara forced a small smile. "Just the storm, Mr. Parsons. It tore half my fence apart. Haven't seen another soul." Eli squinted past her shoulder toward the cabin. "Mind if we look around? Got word a wounded Apache escaped the patrol north of here. He might be hiding out." Her heart thudded so loud she was sure he could hear it. "There's no one here but me, but you can look if you must." He dismounted, mud splattering his boots as he stepped up onto her porch. His eyes roamed the room when she opened the door. She prayed he wouldn't notice the faint outline of disturbed dust where she'd lifted the rug. Eli sniffed the air. "You been cooking for two?" Her stomach dropped. "I make extra," she said quickly. "Old habit." He studied her for a moment, then spat into the fire. "You'd best stay careful out here, Clara. Them savages ain't far." When he finally left, the sound of their horses fading into the distance, Clara's knees nearly gave way. She shut the door, pressed her back to it, and let out a trembling breath. She waited several minutes before lifting the rug again. "They're gone," she whispered down into the darkness. Taza climbed out, his eyes burning with restrained fury. "You lie for me." "I had to," she said. "You'd have been dead before you took another breath." He stepped closer, so close she could see the faint scar on his jaw. "Why?" She swallowed hard. "Because I'm not like them. And maybe you're not like what they say either." For a long, breathless moment, he said nothing. Then he nodded once, slow and solemn. "You brave woman." The words made her heart stumble. Outside, the desert lay quiet once more. But inside that little cabin, danger and trust had found a fragile, unspoken truce. By the end of the week, the wound at Taza's side had nearly closed. The fever was gone, replaced by the restless strength of a man who'd been still too long. He spent his mornings outside, rebuilding Clara's broken fence, his bare shoulders gleaming with sweat under the desert sun. She tried to tell him he didn't owe her, but he only gave her a quiet look that silenced her. In truth, she liked having him there. The rhythm of his axe against the wood, the deep sound of his voice when he spoke softly in his language, it all filled the silence she'd lived with for years, yet every moment of peace carried a shadow of fear. She knew the settlers would return to search again. She also knew that once Taza was strong enough, he'd leave. That thought made her chest ache more than she wanted to admit. That evening, she poured water from the kettle into a basin and called out, "You'll need to clean that wound again. Can't risk it festering." Taza stepped inside, wiping his hands on a rag. The firelight caught the curve of his jaw and the sharp lines of his cheekbones. "You worry too much," he said, sitting down by the fire. "And you talk too little," she replied with a half smile. He met her gaze, his dark eyes unreadable. "Words are heavy. I saved them." She laughed softly. "I see. You're a man who only spends them when they matter." He tilted his head slightly, considering her. "And you? You speak because you fear silence?" Clara froze for a heartbeat, startled by how close he'd come to the truth. "Maybe," she admitted. "When it's quiet, I remember too much." Taza's brow furrowed. "Your husband?" She nodded, looking into the fire. "He was a kind man. Died 3 winters ago. Fever took him fast." There was a silence then, not uncomfortable, but heavy with things that didn't need words. Taza reached toward the fire, picked up the kettle, and poured warm water into the basin himself. "Death takes much," he said quietly. "It took my father, my brothers. Soldiers came, burned our camp. I was not there." Clara's heart twisted. "I'm sorry." He shrugged, though the pain behind his eyes betrayed him. "You are not the one who burned it." She hesitated, then gently pressed the cloth to his side, cleaning around the scar. He didn't flinch this time. Their closeness filled the air with something dangerous, something that wasn't just gratitude or kindness. "Why did you stay here?" he asked after a moment. Why not go east to family? I have no one left, she said simply. This land was my husband's dream. Feels wrong to leave it? He studied her, his gaze softening. You are strong, he murmured. Like women of my tribe. You work, you fight, you keep fire burning. Clara's hand paused on his skin. I don't feel strong most days. He looked at her, really looked, and said, You are. The word struck deeper than she expected. For years she'd been invisible, pitied by neighbors, whispered about by men who thought a woman alone was a weakness waiting to be used. But this man, this so-called savage, looked at her as if she were something sacred. When she finished tending him, she sat back, suddenly aware of the quiet between them. The fire popped softly. Outside, a coyote cried in the distance. Taza leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. When I leave, he said slowly, you will be safe? I don't know, she admitted. Men like Eli Parsons don't forgive easily. And if they learn the truth, I will take them before they take you. Taza interrupted, his tone sharp, protective. She stared at him, stunned. You'd fight for me? He turned his head toward her, the corner of his mouth lifting in a faint, solemn smile. You gave me life. I give you mine if needed. Clara's breath caught. For a long moment, neither moved. Then she rose, breaking the spell. You should rest, she whispered, though her heart was thundering. When she turned away, she felt his eyes on her back, steady, warm, and full of unspoken meaning. That night she lay awake long after the fire died, listening to the faint rhythm of his breathing from across the room. Two worlds, hers and his, had collided by accident, but somewhere in the middle something fragile and forbidden was beginning to grow. The nights had grown cooler since the storm. The desert air, sharp and clear, drifted through the cracks in the cabin walls. Clara sat by the hearth sewing a tear in her skirt, though her fingers had grown clumsy from exhaustion. Across the room, Taza sat sharpening his knife, the rhythmic scrape of metal on stone filling the silence. It had been nearly 2 weeks since she found him. The wound had healed to a thin red scar, but the weight between them had deepened, something neither dared to name. When she looked up, she caught him watching her again, his eyes dark and steady in the firelight. He looked away when their gazes met, but not fast enough to hide what flickered there, something that made her pulse stumble. She tried to laugh lightly. You'll wear that blade down to nothing if you keep at it all night. His lips curved faintly. Better a dull knife than a dull man. She smiled despite herself. His English had improved slowly, carefully, but each word seemed deliberate, chosen like an arrow before it's loosed. You sound more like us every day, she said. He paused, setting the knife aside. I am not like you, he said simply. The words stung more than they should have. You're not wrong, she admitted softly. But maybe we're not so different either. He said nothing for a while, only fed another piece of wood into the fire. The crackle filled the silence. Outside, the wind sighed through the junipers, then in a quiet voice he said, When I heal, I go. You know this, Clara nodded, her throat tight. I know. He turned toward her, his expression unreadable. You saved me. For that I thank you. But I cannot stay. My people wait for me, or my bones. If they find I live, they will need me. Her hands fell to her lap. And what if I need you? The words escaped before she could stop them. The firelight flickered across her face, revealing the fear behind her calm. She had lost one man to death and another to duty. She wasn't sure she could bear losing this one to the wild. Taza studied her, his gaze softening. You are strong, Clara Bennett. You do not need any man. She shook her head slowly. I didn't, not until now. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he rose to his feet, silent as shadow, and crossed the room. He stopped before her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. Her heart pounded so loudly she thought it might wake the whole desert. Why do you look at me that way? She whispered. Because I do not want to go, he said quietly, and that is dangerous for you and for me. Lightning flashed in the distance, silent and far away, illuminating his face in stark lines. In that moment, he didn't look like an outcast or an enemy. He looked like a man fighting himself. She stood, barely aware she was moving until she was close enough to feel his breath. Then stay, she whispered. Just for tonight. Taza's jaw tightened. If I stay, I do not leave. Then don't. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. No storm, no war, no past. Only the two of them standing in the soft glow of the fire, breathing the same air. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and brushed a loose strand of hair from her cheek. You are not afraid? He asked. Clara met his gaze. I've been afraid every day since I buried my husband. But not of you. The fire snapped behind them, scattering sparks that glowed like tiny stars before fading into the dark. She felt his forehead touch hers, a gesture more sacred than any word. For a long time, neither moved. Then in a voice rough and low, he murmured, "Only you." Outside, thunder rolled across the desert, echoing like a distant drum. Inside, the storm had found another home, in the beating of two hearts that had no business finding each other, yet could no longer turn away. Dawn crept slowly over the desert, soft pink light spilling across the valley and seeping through the cracks in the cabin walls. Clara woke to the faint scent of smoke and cedar, the low sound of the wind brushing the shutters. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. Then she turned her head and saw him, Taza, kneeling beside the hearth, feeding the fire back to life. He had risen early. His movements were quiet, deliberate, as if he feared to wake her. But she was already awake, her heart a tangle of emotions she couldn't name. The night before lingered between them, heavy, wordless, sacred. Not a storm of passion, but something deeper. A meeting of two wounded souls who had found, for one fleeting night, peace in each other's arms. Clara sat up, clutching the quilt closer. "You're up early," she said softly, her voice still rough from sleep. He didn't look at her right away. "The sun comes. I rise with it." "You didn't sleep much," she said. He paused, stirring the coals with a stick. "Sleep not needed. The night was enough." The quiet sincerity in his voice sent a tremor through her. She looked down at her hands, trying to find steady ground between what she'd done and what it meant. "I don't know what happens now," she whispered. Taza finally turned, his gaze calm but steady. "We live this day," he said. "Tomorrow not here yet." His simplicity humbled her. She'd spent years tangled in grief, regrets, and half-remembered prayers while he, even scarred and hunted, lived only in truth and presence. He rose and stepped outside, the door closing softly behind him. Through the small window, she watched him walk to the well, bare-chested, the morning light brushing across his bronze skin. He moved like someone born of the land itself, strong, sure, unbroken. She busied herself at the stove, heating coffee, slicing bread, pretending that this morning was ordinary. But nothing about it was. The air itself seemed to hum differently. When he came back inside, she handed him a tin cup. "Coffee," she said. He accepted it with a nod, sniffed it cautiously, then took a sip. His face twisted in surprise. "Bitter," he muttered. She laughed, the sound easing the tension in her chest. "It's an acquired taste. You'll learn." He looked at her over the rim of the cup. "You teach me?" "If you promise not to spit it out," she teased. A ghost of a smile tugged at his mouth, the kind that changed his whole face. He drank again, slower this time. For a few minutes they ate in silence, the morning light warming the cabin. But the peace couldn't last. From the north faintly came the echo of horses, distant but unmistakable. Clara froze the bread halfway to her lips. She met Taza's eyes, and in that instant they both understood. "They come again," he said, his voice low. "Eli Parsons won't stop until he finds what he's looking for," she said, heart racing. "We have to hide you." Taza shook his head. "No more hiding. You'll be killed," she said, her voice sharp with fear. "If they catch you here," his eyes softened, though his tone remained firm. "If I run now, they chase. If I stay, maybe they pass, or maybe I fight." Clara's throat tightened. "I can't lose you, too." For the first time, he looked away, his jaw tightening. "This life is war for me, Clara. For you, it should not be." She stepped closer, her hand trembling as she reached up to touch his arm. "Maybe I don't get to choose that anymore." He looked down at her hand on his skin, then back into her eyes. Something deep, unspoken, passed between them. Finally, he said quietly, "Then I stay. Not for fight. For you." She closed her eyes for a heartbeat, steadying her breath. The sound of distant hooves grew louder. Whatever they were to each other, strangers, allies, something more, it would be tested before the day was done. Outside, the sun climbed higher, spilling gold across the red earth. Inside, Clara and Taza stood shoulder to shoulder in the tiny cabin, bound now by more than mercy or circumstance. They were bound by choice. By late morning, the sound of horses was no longer distant, it was closing in. Dust clouds swirled above the valley ridge, and Clara's pulse raced like a trapped bird. She gripped the windowsill, watching the riders appear one by one against the glare of the desert sun. Taza stood behind her, silent, his eyes narrowing as he counted them. 5, he said. Same men? Yes, she whispered. Eli Parsons is leading them. The name alone brought a chill. Parsons was a man who hated anything he couldn't control, Apaches, widows, or women who dared speak for themselves. He'd once offered Clara protection, and when she refused, he'd spat in the dust and called her a fool. Now he had reason to finish what his pride had started. They will come to the door again, Taza said. Clara turned, her heart thudding. Then we'll do what we did before. You'll hide. He shook his head. No, they see fear, they search harder. Then what do you suggest? She asked. He took her hands in his, strong, calloused, warm. You trust me? She hesitated, the world spinning between sense and instinct. Then she nodded once. With my life, Taza gave a small nod. Then listen. When they come, you speak calm. You tell them you saw Apache tracks far east near the river. I go now, circle behind. If fight comes, you stay down. Taza. He lifted his hand to her cheek, silencing her. No more hiding, he repeated softly. Before she could stop him, he slipped out the back door and vanished into the scrub beyond the barn. She wanted to chase him, to drag him back inside, but the sound of hooves stopped her. Moments later, the riders thundered up to the cabin. Eli Parsons dismounted first, his boots crunching on dry earth. Mrs. Bennett? He called, voice oily with false politeness. Seems we meet again. Clara stepped outside, forcing her fear down deep. Mr. Parsons, what brings you back so soon? He smiled without warmth. Heard tell from a ranch hand up north that an Apache's been sighted near your creek. Figured we'd make sure you were safe. I haven't seen anyone, she said evenly. But there were tracks by the river 2 days ago. East of here. Eli studied her, his pale eyes cold. You sure about that? I don't make a habit of lying, she said. He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath. Funny thing. A woman alone might not always know what she's seen or what she's hiding. Clara's jaw tightened. You're welcome to look around, same as before. He turned to his men. Search the barn. Check the shed. They scattered, boots crunching over the dry ground. Clara stood still, her heartbeat echoing in her ears. She prayed Taza was far enough away, hidden in the canyon, safe from sight. Minutes crawled by like hours. Then one of the men shouted from the barn, Hey, Eli! You might want to see this. Clara's stomach dropped. Eli strode toward the barn, his spurs jingling. She couldn't breathe. The moment stretched taut until a sudden noise cut through the air, a cry, a thud, then chaos. One of the riders stumbled out of the barn, clutching his arm, blood seeping between his fingers. Arrows whistled from the sagebrush, sharp and fast. Another man fell, his rifle clattering to the dirt. Apache, someone screamed. Eli spun, drawing his gun, shouting orders. Horses reared, kicking up clouds of dust. Clara ducked behind the porch post, her hands over her ears as gunfire shattered the air. From the ridge beyond the cabin came Taza, bow drawn, moving like a shadow among the rocks. Every arrow he loosed found its mark. He was a blur of fury and grace, defending not just himself but her. When the dust finally settled, only 2 riders fled north, Eli among them. The others lay still. Clara rushed out, her dress torn, her voice trembling. Taza! He appeared from the brush, panting, his arm bleeding from a graze. She ran to him, gripping his shoulders. You're hurt. He shook his head. Not bad. His eyes softened as they met hers. They gone. You safe. Tears burned her eyes, part fear, part relief. You shouldn't have. He touched her face gently. I said I stay. I said I protect. Behind them, smoke from a burning saddle drifted into the air, black against the golden sky. The peace they'd built was gone, shattered by blood and bullets. But as she looked into Taza's eyes, Clara knew one truth with absolute clarity. She wasn't afraid anymore. Not of the men who hated her, nor of the desert's dangers. She feared only what would happen when he finally had to leave. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the desert lay still again, as if the previous day's violence had been a feverish dream. Clara moved quietly around the cabin, packing a few essentials into her saddlebag: bread, jerky, water, and a worn blanket. Every sound made her flinch: the caw of a distant crow, the creak of the cabin door. even the faint whisper of wind through the junipers. Taza emerged from the brush, his dark eyes scanning the horizon. The slight graze along his forearm had already begun to scab over, but he made no mention of it. He surveyed the ridge where the men had fled. "They follow," he said simply. Clara's stomach tightened. "We have to go," he nodded. "Yes, before more come." Together they mounted their horses. Taza led the way, moving silently along a path he knew well. The narrow canyons carved into the red cliffs that ringed the valley like ancient guardians. Clara followed, her hands gripping the reins, trying not to think about how exposed they were or how quickly the posse could regroup. The silence between them was tense but not uncomfortable. Taza didn't speak much, only occasionally glancing back to make sure she was keeping up. Clara, in turn, watched him, the rhythm of his movements, the way his muscles flexed beneath his skin, the sharp intensity of his eyes. There was something mesmerizing in his focus, something that reminded her why she had saved him in the first place, and why she had stayed by his side all these days. Hours passed, the sun climbing higher and then dipping toward the horizon. The canyons twisted and turned, rocky walls shielding them from any prying eyes. Finally, they reached a small plateau overlooking the valley below, a hidden spot that Taza had chosen for rest. He dismounted first, holding out a hand to help her down. "Safe for now," he said, his voice low and steady. Clara nodded, trying to calm the thundering in her chest. "For now," she echoed, knowing all too well that danger was never truly gone. They sat together on a flat rock, their horses grazing nearby. The wind carried the scent of sage and warm earth, and for a moment they allowed themselves to breathe. Taza reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. His touch was gentle, almost reverent, and Clara felt a shiver run down her spine. "You saved me," he said quietly, his dark eyes locking with hers. "I am alive because of you, and I don't know why I didn't leave you there," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I should have been too afraid." He shook his head. "Fear is not weakness. You chose courage. That is stronger than most men I have known." Clara felt a warmth in her chest, a fragile hope blossoming amid the tension and fear. "I don't want to go back," she whispered. Taza's jaw tightened. "Neither do I. But if we stay here too long, the law, the settlers, they will find us." She took a deep breath, letting the wind fill her lungs. "Then we leave. We go where no one can follow, where we can be free." He studied her for a long moment, then finally nodded. "Then we ride." The two of them mounted again, and this time they didn't look back. They rode side by side through the canyonlands, winding paths that twisted like veins through the red cliffs. The desert stretched wide around them, empty and untamed. But now it held a promise of something more, a life beyond fear, beyond judgment, beyond the reach of those who would harm them. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the canyons in gold and shadow, Clara realized that for the first time in her life she felt truly alive. Beside her, Taza rode silently, steadfast and unwavering, his presence both shield and comfort. Whatever lay ahead, she knew they would face it together, and for the first time that was enough. The canyon walls narrowed as they rode deeper into the hidden valleys, shadows stretching long under the late afternoon sun. Clara's hands ached from holding the reins, her muscles stiff from the ride, but she didn't complain. Beside her, Taza rode with the calm precision of a man born to these lands. Every so often he glanced at her, checking that she was keeping pace, his dark eyes softening for a brief moment before returning to the path ahead. Eventually, they reached the edge of a small clearing where the canyon opened into a wider valley. The sun fell golden across the landscape, illuminating a group of figures waiting at the far side. Clara's heart skipped a beat. She recognized the shapes of Taza's people. His tribe. He slowed his horse and lifted a hand in greeting. The others stepped forward, cautious but curious, eyes sharp with suspicion. Taza dismounted first, stretching slightly after the long ride. He looked back at Clara, his expression conflicted. "This is where your people are," she said softly. They'll welcome you." He shook his head. "Yes, but they do not welcome outsiders. You cannot come." Clara's stomach twisted. She had imagined this moment, feared this moment, and now it had come. She had grown to rely on him, to need him in ways she could not yet name. To leave him here, even for his own safety, was unthinkable. "I don't want to leave," she whispered, clutching the reins. Taza took a slow step toward her. "If you stay with me, he said, his voice low, steady, and dangerous in its quiet intensity. We leave everything behind. This valley, my tribe, your life as you know it. Are you ready? Clara swallowed hard. She thought of the settlers who had hunted them, of the lawless land they had fled, and of the freedom they could find together. Her heart pounded like a drum. I am, she said finally. He reached out, resting a firm hand on her shoulder. Then it is your choice. Stay and ride with me. Leave, and you go back to the life they expect you to live. The wind picked up, rustling the juniper trees and carrying the scent of sage. Clara closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the decision pressing against her chest. Every instinct in her screamed for survival. Caution and safety, but another voice, softer and more insistent, whispered of trust, of courage, of love she had not yet allowed herself to name. Finally, she opened her eyes and looked at him. His face was a map of determination, pride, and longing. I choose you, she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. Taza's dark eyes softened and he smiled, not a small smile, but a slow, quiet curve that transformed his whole face. Then we ride together, he said. He swung onto his horse first, reaching down to help her mount. She took a deep breath as she settled into the saddle beside him. The valley stretched before them, wild and untamed, the horizon painted with gold and shadow. For a moment they simply rode in silence, letting the wind carry them forward. Behind them lay the life they had known, danger, fear, and loss. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also freedom. And between them, something stronger than fear had grown, trust, respect, and a connection that neither time nor circumstance could erase. As they climbed a ridge and looked back one last time, the canyon below glimmered in the fading light, untouched and silent. Clara felt the weight of her choice settle in her chest, not a burden but a release. Taza reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Where you go, I follow, he said softly. And where you go, she replied, her hand resting over his. I will stay. Together, they rode into the deepening shadows, leaving behind the world that had hunted them and stepping fully into a life of their own making, wild, free, and bound by the promise they had made to one another. The valley stretched before them like a hidden world untouched by men or law. Red cliffs rose on either side, dotted with juniper and sage, and the river curved through the earth like a ribbon of silver. Clara felt the weight of the day's ride in her shoulders, but it was nothing compared to the exhilaration that pulsed through her veins. Freedom had a taste, and it was bittersweet, sharp with risk and alive with possibility. Taza rode beside her, his eyes scanning the horizon as if he carried the land itself in his gaze. There was a quiet pride in the way he moved, a stillness born of survival and mastery of the wilderness. Yet when he looked at her, that fierceness softened into something else, something tender and unwavering. They stopped at the edge of a sheltered canyon where the river curved, forming a natural bend that offered safety and privacy. Taza dismounted and reached down to help Clara from her horse. Her legs were stiff, her hands sore, but she did not complain. She was alive, truly alive, and that mattered more than any discomfort. This place, it can be ours, Taza said, his voice low, reverent. He gestured to the canyon, the cliffs, the river, the wide open sky above. Hidden, safe. We live here as we choose. Clara looked around, feeling the raw beauty of the valley seep into her bones. She thought of all they had fled, the towns, the settlers, the threats that had dogged them for weeks. Here, none of it mattered. She could almost feel the land embracing them, promising protection in its isolation. I never imagined, she began, but Taza pressed a finger to her lips. Do not speak of what was, he said. Only what is. Only what we choose now. Clara's heart swelled. For weeks she had carried fear and uncertainty like heavy stones in her chest. Now with Taza by her side, the stones fell away. The valley felt sacred, like a place where the past could be laid to rest and the future could be shaped by their own hands. He took her hand and guided her to the edge of the river, where the water ran clear and cold over smooth stones. We survive, he said. We endure. And we promise never to let the world take this from us. Clara's fingers tightened around his. I promise, she whispered. No matter what comes, we stay. Together. He nodded, a small, solemn smile touching his lips. Only you, he said. They sat together by the river, letting the current carry away the last remnants of fear and sorrow. The sun dipped low behind the cliffs, painting the canyon in gold and crimson. Birds called across the water, and the wind stirred through the juniper, as if nature itself bore witness to the vow they had made. Hours passed, the day fading into evening and then into the deep indigo of night. Stars sparkled above like scattered diamonds, and the desert settled around them, silent but alive. Taza built a small fire, and they huddled close, not speaking, only feeling the quiet certainty of each other's presence. Clara rested her head against his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart. She had once thought she would live and die alone, that her life would be a series of empty days marked by loss. Now, with Taza beside her, she realized that even in a harsh, wild world, love could bloom, slowly, fiercely, and without apology. He kissed her forehead, a gentle, sacred gesture, and whispered, "Where you are, I am, forever." Clara closed her eyes, tears slipping quietly down her cheeks. Not of sorrow, but of relief and joy. "Forever," she echoed. And in that hidden valley, beneath the stars and the watchful cliffs, two hearts that had once been broken found home in each other. The world outside could rage, hunt, or burn, but here they were untouchable. Here they were free. Here their promise was written into the land itself. Only you, only us. Forever. The fire crackled softly, the river murmured below, and the wind carried the echo of a vow that would never be broken.